What was the Italian naval strategy in the Mediterranean during World War II? What strategic and operational constraints were faced by the Regia Marina, and how the overall picture changed during the course of the war? I will answer these questions in a moment after the intro, utilizing the words of Admiral Giuseppe Fioravanzo, a key figure in the Italian naval leadership during the conflict. His words are taken from an article that he published in 1958 with the US Naval Institute, and you can find the link in the description below. I will insert from time to time my comments following his words. Some comments may also redirect to other videos that you already find on the channel. If you like my video content, please consider subscribing, becoming a member, or simply pressing the like button. Italy entered the war on June 10, 1940, at the will of Mussolini. This political dictator and military chief was under the illusion that the imminent defeat of France would result in a rapid conclusion of the conflict, with the victory of Germany. It was in vain that the Navy Chief of Staff, Admiral Cavagnari, on April 14th had warned him that, lacking the possibility of achieving important strategic objectives or the defeat of the enemy naval forces, to enter the war on our own initiative does not seem justified, also in view of the prospect of having to stay on the defensive at sea. Whatever character the war may assume in the Mediterranean, in the end the sum of our naval losses will be large. Italy could come to the peace negotiations not only without territorial gains, but without a fleet, and perhaps without an air force as well. Implicit in these prophetic words was the concept of a long and wearing struggle. It was again in vain that the Chief of the General Staff, Marshal Pietro Badoglio, had warned Mussolini that the country was not ready to support an armed conflict, since military preparation for it were still incomplete. This was because Germany, without taking into account the pacts made with Italy, had followed a policy leading to war 3 years before the time agreed upon, if war were to prove to be inevitable. The initial war plans, as determined in accordance with Mussolini's directives, were land fronts, offensive in the Western Alps against France, already close to surrendering, precautionary observation of Yugoslavia, initial defensive attitude on the Albanian front, Albania at this time being in the Italian orbit, to be modified in accordance with developments in the situation in the Balkans. Defensive in Libya, same for Tunisia and Egyptian fronts. Defensive in the Aegean Sea, air and sea offensive throughout the Mediterranean. As for Italian East Africa, all possibility of communication with Italy was ruled out, and therefore, since the area would depend solely on its own means, it was considered a lost territory should the war prove to be long. The contradictions appear evident between the decisions to attack the Anglo-French forces in entering the war on our own initiative and the concepts of action that were practically exclusively defensive. In fact, from a military point of view, the attack on the French frontier could not be considered as a true offensive, but rather a last-minute intervention decided upon for political reasons vis-à-vis the Germans, and thus analogous to the Russian attack against Japan in 1945, when the latter was already on the point of surrender. This is even more true since the plans prescribed to remain on the defensive in the Western Alps if the rapid defeat of France did not come about. The only offensive really carried through was that by air and sea. But what were the premises and the prospects of such an offensive? Mussolini, on the 31st of March 1940, had given Badoglio the directive for the Navy to go all the way. Badoglio commented on this with these words: "As to the Navy going all the way, I say that this must be interpreted in the sense that it should not throw itself head down against the British and French fleets, but take up a disposition, above all with its submarines, designed to hinder the enemy's shipping." Admiral Cavagnari had observed, "One enemy fleet will be based in Gibraltar, another one in Suez, and we will suffocate inside the Mediterranean." On the 1st of June, these ideas had been reconfirmed and clarified by Badoglio with the phrase: "If an objective can be assigned to the Navy, it is that of surveying the Mediterranean with its submarines," and by Cavagnari with the explanatory words: "The directives are defensive to the west and the east, secure control of the Sicilian Channel." But the true mission of the Navy, one confirmed from the very beginning of hostilities, was that of assuring supplies to the forces fighting in Libya. Subordinate to this mission was that of attacking British shipping throughout the Mediterranean. The location of our bases, Brindisi, Taranto, Augusta, Messina, Palermo, Trapani, Naples, Cagliari, Tripoli and Benghazi, in the center of the Mediterranean, permitted the naval forces, with the cooperation of the Air Force, to carry out both objectives at the same time, the former defensive, the latter offensive. Ever since 1938, the Navy, with respect to a document of the Army and Air Force General Staffs, which requested the Navy plans for the transportation of men and supplies to Libya, had acknowledged the following points. Since the risks of crossing would be greater than stopover in the ports because of air attacks, it was necessary to stockpile the maximum quantity of material, munitions and vehicles in Africa during peacetime, so that, in wartime, transportation activities would largely be dedicated only to transfer the personnel on fast ships. To complete the mobilization and the equipment of the units stationed in Libya at the time of the declaration of war, shipping should be limited to one big monthly convoy, protected by all the available means of the Navy and the Air Force, in such a way as to achieve temporary control of the sea, in the zone of the crossing. Since this would be the central Mediterranean area, where the enemy held the naval and air base of Malta, the occupation of Malta was the indispensable condition for any important Italian operation in North Africa. Since just neutralizing the island by naval blockade and air bombings would not accomplish the purpose. The enemy could supply the island continuously with planes taking off from aircraft carriers. On this point, I redirect you to the video about the problem of invading Malta in 1940, a very difficult task to accomplish given the geography and the defenses of the island, without mentioning the superiority numbers of the British and French fleet vis-à-vis the Italians at the time of this planning exercise. When war broke out on the 1st of September 1939, Italy declared its non-belligerence, by which, so as not to alarm France and Britain, nothing was done to build up the forces stationed in North Africa, contrary to the pre-war plans. Thus, when Italy opened hostilities on the 10th of June 1940, the Navy was immediately confronted by the operational problem of assuring the military traffic directed to Libya. The traffic, because of the limited capacity of the ports of Tripoli and Benghazi, had to be carried on throughout the whole war by many small convoys rather than by few large ones. In total, 1,274 convoys in the 35 months between the 10th of June 1940 and the 12th of May 1943, the date when Tunisia was abandoned. The burden created by this uninterrupted traffic greatly reduced the liberty of initiative of the fleet, which could have been directed against the enemy forces, divided into two fleets, one at Alexandria and one at Gibraltar, with the purpose of securing control of the Mediterranean by fighting them, if possible, separately. On this point, it must be recalled that the Italian battle fleet in any case was limited to operate in an area that stretched from the Balearic Islands to the south of Crete, given the range limits of the escorting destroyers, assuming a departure from La Spezia if operating in the western basin, or from Taranto if operating in the eastern one. Given the absence of any Allied commercial traffic, the Italians would have waited for the British or French to accept battle. But why should the Italians or the Allies accept battle if the tactical situation and the balance of forces were not favorable? Back to the article. Other limitations on strategic initiative, ones that were felt even more seriously as the war grew longer, were determined by the growing fuel oil deficiencies, then by the lack of effective air cooperation, and by the necessity not to risk heavy losses of ships because of the lack of raw materials and adequate industrial facilities, since they could not be replaced. Foreseeing these difficulties, the initial plan of operation laid down by the Navy General Staff was based on the following directives, which were maintained unchanged in their fundamental elements during the whole war. Being supposed that the enemy would have, as essential objectives, the interdiction of our communications at sea, seeking combat under conditions favorable to him, air bombardments of our bases and ports, and protection of his own essential shipping throughout the Mediterranean, the best program for the Italian Navy would be: first, to stay on the defensive in the eastern and western basins of the Mediterranean, and on the offensive and counter-offensive in the central Mediterranean, to hinder the meeting of the two enemy fleets by maneuvering our own naval forces supported by an effective blockade of the Sicilian Channel achieved by minefields, torpedo boats and submarine patrols. Avoid encounter with decisively superior forces. Wear down the enemy by widespread use of submarines, torpedo boats and assault units. Protect communications with the home islands, Libya, Albania and the Dodecanese Islands. Engage the enemy fleet, if possible, in areas not far from our bases. Defend the coastal area with local means, minefields, coastal batteries, mobile patrol units with limited ranges of action. The cooperation of the Air Force was not explicitly laid down in the directives, because the Air Force held to the uncompromising doctrine of an independent air war conducted according to their own rules, which were never communicated either to the Navy or the Army. The lack of a joint plan with the German Navy and Hitler's non-comprehension about the importance of the Mediterranean theater had a negative impact on the conduct of operations throughout the whole war. A key example of this lack of comprehension was the refusal of German air assistance to carry out the assault on Malta in the summer of 1942, in spite of the insistence of the Italian Supreme Command and particularly of the Navy, which had already prepared and trained the amphibious forces necessary for the operation. At the time, Malta was in quite a critical condition, because the island had been subjected to an intensified hammering from the air for quite some months. In mid-June 1942, the British had tried to get supplies to the island with two convoys at the same time, one from the east and one from the west. Because of the prompt reaction of the Italian naval forces, the first convoy from the east had to give up, while only a few ships from the second convoy arrived, bringing that minimum of supplies which Malta required to carry on its function as an operational base. To summarize, in its fundamental elements, the conduct of war by the Italian Navy in the Mediterranean was based upon the following concepts: to secure the traffic with the overseas territories, so that army operations could be conducted there; to interfere with the enemy trans-Mediterranean communications; to inflict maximum losses on the enemy by air, underwater or surface assault units; to keep the main units always ready for action, having them to intervene in strategically important moments. These fundamental concepts were applied in the course of the conflict in various ways, according to the necessities and possibilities of the occasion. 6 events that can be called crucial influenced in a determining way the evolution of our Mediterranean strategy: the attack against Greece, the occupation of Crete, the advance to El Alamein, the Allied landings in Algeria, the abandonment of Tunisia, followed by the Allied landing in Sicily, and the fall of fascism. When Supermarina, the Central Operational Command of the Navy, had the feeling in mid-September 1940 that Mussolini was considering an act of force on the eastern shores of the Adriatic, with Greece selected as the objective, it immediately took a clear position against such a project. This was done through a memorandum which, while it didn't refer directly to Greece, had the purpose of alerting against the error of dispersing our forces. The memorandum began with the following points. The Egyptian front must be considered equally as important as the Channel front. The latter permits striking at the heart of Great Britain. The former permits striking the British Empire at its most sensitive point. It is very difficult to determine, in case Britain does not give up because of the air offensive alone, which of the two fronts may offer the lesser resistance. In the north, it is the case of attacking the enemy across the sea in his home territory. In the south, it is the case of carrying the attack to the vital zone of the Nile Delta, across a desert area that represents an obstacle comparable to that of a sea route. The latter, in fact, offers an infinite number of supply lines, but the desert cannot be challenged except by a large, expensive and spread out organization. Furthermore, the British in Egypt could consider themselves practically at home because their forces could be supplied through the Red Sea and from the nearby Middle East, without the Italians being able to interfere to any great degree with their supply lines. On the other hand, we have two supply forces deployed about 3,000 kilometers from the homeland, and 1/3 of this distance is a sea route, and 2/3 a primitive desert. For this, it follows that it is indispensable, in order to assure the success of the operations in Egypt, to make the sea communications across the central Mediterranean secure, to assure good protection to the Libyan ports, to locate the African discharge points as far east as possible in order to reduce uneconomical transportation along the inadequate coastal road to the minimum, to concentrate the maximum forces in a minimum time in the direction of Egypt, particularly if the campaign in the north is not won quickly. Not to disperse our energies in other directions, because further existent political, economic or territorial aims in those directions would automatically be achieved as a result of the victory of the British Empire. This last phrase was the most important in the whole memorandum, being purposely directed toward avoiding useless and crippling diversions in other sectors of the Mediterranean. The memorandum continued with an examination of the operational possibilities at sea, concluding that the Italian fleet can afford long-range protection for the communications with Tripoli and also with Benghazi, but it is not able to prevent attacks against these ports, particularly those made by planes coming from aircraft carriers. As for nuisance actions by enemy surface units against shore positions and the rear areas of our army, the Navy can neither prevent nor repress them, because of the relation existing between the distance of such targets from Alexandria and from our bases. We can only carry on war in the coastal waters of the zone with submarine patrols and minefields. The conclusion of the memorandum again brings up the fundamental ideas expressed at the beginning. Given that any other objective appears secondary with respect to that of assuring the troops deployed on the Egyptian front the power for a decisive attack, all the energies of the armed forces must be directed toward the achievement of this goal. If the problem cannot be resolved with our own technical resources, we cannot draw back from requesting aid from our ally. Nor can he fail to grant such aid, particularly if the situation in the north should become stabilized. This holds all the more because the coming winter season is prohibitive for operations in the north, but favorable in North Africa. Measures were then suggested to be taken to build up the operational capacity of the Navy and the Air Force at sea and to assure the anti-aircraft defenses of the Libyan ports. Mussolini didn't want to accept the suggestion to request Germany for technical aid, modern weapons and other equipment that Italy lacked. But when the first British offensive in the winter of 1940-1941 threatened to cause us to abandon Cyrenaica and maybe Tripolitania, he was forced, against his will, to turn to the Germans in a position of weakened military prestige. He then accepted the intervention of the troops commanded by Rommel. Furthermore, the opening of hostilities against Greece, which took place on the 28th of October 1940 and later led to the resignation of Badoglio as Chief of General Staff, brought the Navy face to face with that dispersion of forces against which it had warned. It is sufficient to note that, up until the 8th of September 1943, the Navy had to provide for the defense of 4,483 small convoys that comprise the continuous traffic between Italy and Greece, including the Aegean Islands. Shortly after the beginning of the Italian operations against Greece, the British had occupied Crete. in order to support Greece better with naval forces stationed on an island directly on the Alexandria-Piraeus route, in an excellent position to protect the convoys supplying their new ally. While the occupation of Greece by Italian and German troops was underway in May 1941 and the Italian Navy was taking possession of the Greek islands in the Ionian and Aegean seas, the Germans decided to drive the British out of Crete. The purpose was a double one: to render the situation in the Aegean stable and secure, and to improve the strategic situation in the Mediterranean by making an air naval base out of Crete, which would increase the threat against the British supply lines running from Alexandria to Malta. As it is known, the operation against Crete was carried out by the Luftwaffe, with airborne landings coordinated with the landings of troops brought by sea across the Aegean under the escort of light Italian units. The operation caused heavy losses among the German paratroopers, but the Royal Navy, in turn, paid a high toll during the following evacuation of troops from Crete to Egypt. The lack of aircraft carriers in the area at that time was one of the principal causes of the Mediterranean fleet losses, since it could not effectively defend the transports and the escorts against enemy air attacks. In other words, the Royal Navy, on that occasion, suffered the damaging consequences of the absence of aircraft carriers, just as the Italian Navy suffered from it during the whole war. On this point, I might add that the aircraft carrier Formidable made a very last appearance in the final stages of the battle by launching an air attack against an Italian airport in the Dodecanese, and during the return voyage she was hit by German bombers. The German Navy, or rather its Supreme Command, the Seekriegsleistung or SKL, would have preferred that the Italian Navy, after the fall of Crete, had intensified its activity in the eastern Mediterranean, transferring to that island and nearby ones the maximum number possible of light units and escorts and patrol crafts to cooperate with the air forces. This would involve giving up the use of the battleships. Supermarina informed the SKL that we could not give up keeping all types of ships ready for action, because we had to defend the vital communications with Libya against attacks, which the British could carry out with full freedom of choice as to means, method and time. The contrary held true in the North Sea and the Atlantic, where it was Germany which had the freedom of initiative in attacks against the shipping upon which the very life of the British Islands depended. To concentrate the escort units in Crete would have provoked the operational paralysis of the capital ships for lack of escort crafts. It would have diminished the protection for the daily convoys to Libya and Greece, and would have decreased the effectiveness of the blockade, one of decisive importance, of the Sicilian Channel. In addition, there were other reasons which prevented important changes in the strategy followed up to that moment. First, the practical difficulties in transforming these anchorages into sufficiently equipped and defended bases. Secondly, the fuel oil shortage, which was already making itself felt and forcing reduced activity on the part of the capital ships. Third, Malta's operational effectiveness, which still seemed unreduced despite the attacks which the 10th Flieger Corps had begun some months before, in assistance to the Italian Air Force. Thus Crete could have been advantageously exploited as an air base, but not as a naval one. Only the neutralization of Malta, in expectation of its much desired occupation, would have permitted a radical change in the conduct of the war. As already mentioned, the Italian and German air forces had resumed the heavy bombings of Malta in February 1942, with the result that this base, by spring, was judged by the commander of the German forces in the Mediterranean, Marshal Kesselring, to be sufficiently neutralized to permit a new offensive by Rommel in North Africa. Supermarina, instead, in agreement with the German Navy headquarters in Italy, Admiral Giuseppe, had clearly maintained that no advance could be made without making the supply line to Rommel's army secure by occupying Malta, that continued to pose a constant threat to the Italian communication lines with Libya. On this point, we must remember that after the demise of Force K in December 1941, for the first half of 1942, with the bombings of the island, the capacity to attack and harass the Italian convoys was heavily diminished. The idea of the Italian Supreme Command was to grant Rommel the chance to secure Tobruk, then stop, launch the invasion of Malta, and then, once the island was in Axis' hands, the advance towards the Suez Canal could be resumed. Back to the article. Ships and troops for the invasion of Malta were ready and trained, and in Sicily there was a concentration of air power sufficient to support the operation. However, fuel oil supplies were needed immediately, or the Italian Navy otherwise would have been forced to reduce its activity. The fuel requested was neglected by the German Supreme Command. On the 26th of May, Rommel attacked Libya, reaching the Al-Faya-Sidi Barrani line into Egyptian territory already on the 24th of June. Supermarine and Weichhold, supported by the SKL opinion, advised in vain that the advance should be paused so long as Malta was not occupied. But Rommel said he was certain of victory. A large part of the air forces in Sicily were sent to Cyrenaica to give tactical support to his army, and he continued his advance up to El Alamein, where he arrived on the last day of June and remained nailed down by the resistance of the British Eighth Army. The situation was further aggravated by sending the most of the German aircraft stationed in Sicily to the Russian front. Malta, no longer subjected to intense bombings and supplied by the few ships that succeeded in getting through during the summer, again took up its function as an offensive air base, as the lack of fuel oil, meanwhile, prevented the Italian Navy from protecting the shipping effectively. On this point I should add that during the summer and most of 1942, yes, Malta reacquired some of its potential, but essentially the brunt of the offensive against Axis shipping was carried out by air forces stationed in Egypt, since most of the traffic was taking place towards the eastern port, so Benghazi and Tobruk, and then the coastal traffic from Tobruk to Marsa Matruh and to places nearby the front line. Back to the article. Thus, when the British began their offensive in October, the Axis troops, deprived of the necessary amount of equipment and supplies, retreated all the way to Tunisia, while at their backs the Allied troops had landed in Algeria and were advancing eastward. These landings, nevertheless, were no surprise to Supermarina, which had reported this serious possibility to the Supreme Command in September 1942 and had declared in October that their execution was imminent. In spite of this, the German High Command had insisted, up until the evening before the landing, that it must be a matter of a diversion in connection with the main landing in Provence. Italy could only oppose the Algerian landing with submarines and aircraft, because its fleet, for lack of fuel oil, and destroyers for escort duty and also air cover, could not be used. Nevertheless, the capital ships were concentrated at Naples, with a small detachment of cruisers at La Maddalena, in Sardinia. They were transferred to La Spezia and Genoa after a heavy raid on Naples on the 4th of December. The operational capacity from the upper Tyrrhenian Sea with respect to the western Mediterranean remained unchanged. The distance from La Spezia to Algiers is about equal or even a bit less than that from Naples to Algiers, while the safety from air attacks was much greater. These two events that followed in logical operational relation represented the decisive turn of the tide in the Mediterranean War. Italy, losing control of the Sicilian Channel and being confined to the home waters, by now had lost the war. Its strategy was reduced to the strict defensive in the home waters, and it was clear that it could no longer delay in breaking off with Germany and requesting an armistice. Furthermore, the clear inferiority at sea and in the air, after such heavy losses of combat vessels, supply ships and planes, no longer gave any chance either of maintaining communications with the islands or intervening quickly with the surviving fleet units to oppose the attack against Sicily effectively. Thus, when this attack began on the 10th of July, the Italian reaction had to be limited to nuisance actions by submarines, torpedo boats and planes. Permit me to recall here that in a book written for instruction purposes in 1924, I expressed myself as follows in concluding an analysis on the strategical importance of Sicily. Sicily is the fundamental position in our strategical system in the Mediterranean. If Sicily is lost, the war is lost. I hold that this statement is not exaggerated. It was not. On the 2nd of August 1943, a week after the fall of the fascist government, Supermarina sent a memorandum to the Supreme Command, with a copy going to the German authorities also. Its purpose was to dissipate possible doubts from the German side as to our determination to continue the war at their side, as the new government had publicly proclaimed. Badoglio, the new Prime Minister, in his book Italy in the Second World War, spoke of this pretension of fate as necessary to the negotiations with the Allies, so as to not arouse German suspicions over Italy's pulling out of the disastrous alliance. The memorandum examined the Italian situation at sea from every viewpoint: strategical, logistical, tactical, organizational. As to the use of the naval units that were still effective, Supermarina noted that the battle fleet, reduced to 3 modern battleships, 5 cruisers and only 8 destroyers, was paralyzed for 3 main reasons. The impossibility of staying in the peninsular southern ports, from which its lightning attacks could be made. Impossible because of the air superiority of the Allies. The impossibility of having sufficient air reconnaissance and fighter plane escorts. Thirdly, the extreme scarcity of escorting destroyers. The memorandum noted that within a very few months the number of supply ships and their escorts would be reduced so low that shipping activity in the Tyrrhenian and in the Adriatic could no longer be maintained at significant level. In such a serious state, there was nothing else to do but carry out future lightning raids with small cruisers of the Scipione Africano class, as soon as at least 2 of them were ready. This was the way, we repeat, that Supermarina expressed itself on the 2nd of August 1943. But the day after, it planned a double operation to be entrusted to 2 cruiser divisions, the only ones surviving of the 6 with which we entered the war. The 7th Division at La Spezia was to make a raid with 2 cruisers, the Eugenio di Savoia and Montecuccoli, against the port of Palermo, to hit the Allied shipping there, while the 8th Division, made up by the Garibaldi and Duca d'Aosta, was to carry out a similar one against Beaune, in Tunisia, at the same time. The reason for this unexpected change in plans was to be found exactly in the anxiety to keep the Germans from getting suspicious. The failure of the operation entrusted to the 7th Division, because it ran into some small Allied units before reaching its objective, caused Supermarina to decide to send the 8th Division immediately to repeat the effort of the 7th, thus giving up the raid against Beaune. These were the last operations attempted for political and ethical rather than strategic reasons by the Italian ships previous to moving out from their bases to proceed to Malta with the honours of service, the day after the armistice was proclaimed. But if the armistice had not been signed, the Navy was ready to make the extreme sacrifice of its last ships to try to oppose the Salerno landings. So we finally came to the conclusion of this long article. I hope you have found interesting this analysis by Admiral Giuseppe Fioravanzo, perhaps one of the many unknown admirals of the Italian Navy during World War II. Then, enough from my side, and I hope to see you in the next video.